In the grand corridors of Kensington Palace, where every footstep echoes with centuries of royal tradition, there exists a story that has never been told. A story hidden beneath layers of protocol, duty, and the pristine white gloves that never come off in public. For 3 years, the world has watched Catherine, Princess of Wales, navigate her royal duties with grace and composure. But what they haven't seen is the man who stands silently in the shadows, whose job description says protection, but whose heart speaks a different language entirely. James Mitchell wears the uniform of a royal protection officer, but behind those perfectly polished buttons and beneath those regulation gloves lies a secret that could change everything. In a world where a single glance can make headlines and a moment's hesitation can cost lives, what happens when duty and the heart pull in opposite directions? This is not just another royal story. This is the untold truth about the man who sees her when the cameras stop rolling, who knows her fears when the crowds go home, and who carries a burden heavier than any crown. Behind the gloves lies a story of sacrifice, silent devotion, and a love that can never be spoken but refuses to be ignored. Some secrets are meant to protect the monarchy. Others are meant to protect the heart. But what happens when protecting one means destroying the other? The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Kensington Palace as James Mitchell adjusted his earpiece for the 3rd time. His hands, encased in the regulation white gloves that had become like a second skin, moved with practiced precision. 3 years on the Princess of Wales protection detail, and still, every morning felt like the first day on the job. James had joined the Royal Protection Command straight from the military, where he had served 2 tours in Afghanistan. The transition from desert camouflage to pristine royal uniforms had been jarring, but the core mission remained the same: protect and serve. What he hadn't expected was how different protecting royalty would be from protecting fellow soldiers in a war zone. Morning briefing in 5 minutes, crackled the voice in his earpiece. Detective Inspector Sarah Collins, the head of Catherine's protection team, never wasted words. James straightened his tie and made his way to the security office, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floors that had witnessed centuries of royal history. The briefing room was small and windowless, filled with monitors displaying feeds from cameras positioned throughout the palace grounds. Sarah stood at the head of a conference table, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun that matched her no-nonsense demeanor. Around the table sat the other members of the team: Detective Sergeant Mark Thompson, who handled advanced security; PC Lisa Chun, the newest member who specialized in crowd control; and Detective Constable David Williams, who managed electronic surveillance. Today's schedule, Sarah began, sliding a printed itinerary across the table. Her Royal Highness has a private meeting with the Children's Hospital Trust at 10, lunch with the Danish ambassador's wife at 1, and the opening of the new wing at St. Mary's Hospital at 3. Standard protocols apply, but I want extra attention on the hospital event. Large crowds expected. James studied the schedule, mentally mapping out routes and potential security concerns. Over the past 3 years, he had learned to think like Catherine thought, to anticipate her needs before she voiced them. It wasn't part of his official training, but it had become essential to doing his job well. Mitchell, Sarah's voice cut through his thoughts. You'll be primary today. Thompson is covering the advanced team for tomorrow's engagement in Birmingham. Primary meant he would be the closest to Catherine throughout the day, responsible for her immediate safety and well-being. It was a responsibility he never took lightly, though lately it had become more complicated than he cared to admit. The briefing concluded with the usual reminders about protocol and procedure. As the team dispersed, James remained behind, studying surveillance footage from the previous day's events. He told himself he was looking for security gaps, potential threats that might have been missed. In truth, he found himself watching Catherine's interactions with the public, noting the way her smile brightened when she spoke with children, how she listened intently to the elderly visitors who shared their stories with her. "You're here early again," came a familiar voice from the doorway. James looked up to see PC Chun entering the security office with 2 cups of coffee. She handed him one and settled into the chair beside him. "Couldn't sleep," James replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. Lisa was the only member of the team who had noticed his increased dedication to studying security footage, though she had never asked why. "The hospital event today will be challenging," Lisa observed, pointing to the screen showing the entrance to St. Mary's Hospital. 300 invited guests, plus media, plus the general public. A lot of variables. James nodded, but his attention was drawn to a different monitor showing the private entrance to Catherine's apartments. He had memorized her morning routine over the years, knew that she would emerge in exactly 12 minutes, dressed impeccably and ready to face whatever the day brought. What the public didn't see were the moments before she stepped into her role, the quiet instances when the mask of royal composure slipped just slightly. Last Tuesday, he had arrived early for a morning engagement and found Catherine in the palace gardens, sitting alone on a bench, her shoulders shaking with silent tears. She had just received news that one of the children from a hospital she regularly visited had passed away. By the time she emerged to meet the waiting photographers 20 minutes later, she was the picture of royal grace, but James had seen the real emotion beneath the surface. "James!" Lisa's voice brought him back to the present. "You seem distracted lately. Everything all right?" He forced a smile and drained his coffee cup. "Just focused on the job. Today's schedule is packed." Lisa studied his face for a moment longer than necessary, but didn't press the issue. The truth was, James couldn't explain to anyone, least of all a colleague, what was happening to him. Somewhere between his 2nd and 3rd year on Catherine's protection detail, his professional dedication had evolved into something far more personal and infinitely more dangerous. At precisely 9:48, Catherine emerged from her private entrance. James took his position 3 steps behind, and to her left, his trained eyes constantly scanning for threats, while his peripheral vision remained acutely aware of her every movement. She wore a navy blue dress that complemented her sapphire engagement ring, her hair styled in soft waves that caught the morning light. "Good morning, James," she said quietly as they walked toward the waiting car. It was a small breach of protocol. She wasn't supposed to acknowledge her protection officers by name in public, but it had become a habit over the years. "Good morning, Your Royal Highness," he replied formally, though something in his chest tightened at the sound of his name on her lips. The ride to the first engagement was conducted in comfortable silence. Catherine reviewed her notes, while James monitored radio communications from the advance team. He had learned to recognize her tells over the years. The way she touched her engagement ring when she was nervous, how she gazed out the window when she was lost in thought, the subtle change in her posture when she was preparing to switch into public mode. The Children's Hospital Trust meeting was held in a private conference room at the Lanesborough Hotel. As Catherine discussed funding initiatives and new treatment programs, James positioned himself by the door, his eyes constantly moving between the windows, the entrances, and the faces of everyone in the room. But he found his attention drawn repeatedly to Catherine's passion as she spoke about the children's welfare programs. "The new cancer treatment wing will serve an additional 200 children annually," she was saying, her voice filled with genuine enthusiasm. "But more importantly, it will provide family accommodation so parents can stay close to their children during treatment." James had accompanied Catherine to dozens of hospital visits over the years. He had seen her hold the hands of sick children, comfort grieving parents, and somehow find the right words to bring hope to impossible situations. The public saw these moments through carefully managed photo opportunities, but James witnessed the real emotions, the tears she shed in private afterward, the way these experiences affected her deeply. During a brief break in the meeting, Catherine stepped onto the hotel's terrace for some fresh air. James followed at a respectful distance, but she turned to address him directly. "James, I wanted to thank you for yesterday," she said quietly, ensuring they couldn't be overheard. Yesterday had been another hospital visit, this time to see Emma, a 7-year-old girl with leukemia who had specifically requested to meet the princess. During the visit, Emma had suffered a sudden seizure. While medical staff attended to the child, James had noticed Catherine's distress and had quietly guided her to a private room where she could compose herself away from cameras and crowds. "It's my job, Your Royal Highness," James replied, though they both knew his actions had gone beyond standard protocol. "No," Catherine said firmly, meeting his eyes directly. "Yesterday you saw that I needed a moment, and you gave me space to be human. That's not in any manual." For a dangerous moment, James allowed himself to hold her gaze. In her eyes, he saw not the Princess of Wales, but Catherine, the woman who cried for sick children, who worried about being a good mother to her own children, who sometimes felt overwhelmed by the weight of public expectation. "The children you visit, they see something real in you," James found himself saying, immediately regretting the personal nature of his comment. "That's why these visits matter so much." Catherine's expression softened, and, for an instant, the formal barrier between them seemed to dissolve. Then, her phone buzzed with a reminder about the next engagement, and the moment passed. The lunch with the Danish ambassador's wife proceeded without incident, but James noticed Catherine seemed more relaxed, more genuine in her interactions. He wondered if their brief conversation had something to do with it, then quickly dismissed the thought. His job was to protect her, not to analyze her emotional state. The afternoon's hospital opening was indeed the security challenge Lisa had predicted. Hundreds of people lined the streets outside St. Mary's Hospital, hoping to catch a glimpse of Catherine. Inside, the new wing was packed with dignitaries, medical staff, and patients' families. James coordinated with the building's security team and positioned additional officers at key points throughout the facility. As Catherine toured the new treatment rooms, James found himself studying not just the crowd, but her reactions to everything she saw. She stopped to speak with a young mother whose son was receiving treatment, listening intently as the woman explained how the new family accommodation would allow her to stay close to her child. "It means everything," the mother said, tears in her eyes. "Being able to hold his hand when he's scared, to be there when he wakes up from surgery." Catherine's own eyes filled with tears, though she maintained her composure. "I'm a mother too," she said gently. "I understand completely." James watched this interaction from across the room, struck by the authenticity of Catherine's compassion. In that moment, she wasn't performing royal duty. She was genuinely connecting with another mother's pain. The formal ceremony concluded with Catherine unveiling a plaque dedicating the new wing. As she posed for photographs with hospital administrators, James noticed a disturbance near the main entrance. His earpiece crackled with urgent communication from the perimeter team. "Possible security concern at the main entrance," came Sarah's voice. "Individual attempting to breach barriers." James immediately moved closer to Catherine, his hand instinctively moving toward his radio. The individual turned out to be a distraught father whose child was being treated at the hospital. He had been trying to get Catherine's attention to thank her personally for funding the new wing. Security personnel calmed the situation quickly, but the incident served as a reminder of how quickly circumstances could change. During the drive back to Kensington Palace, Catherine was unusually quiet. James could see in the rearview mirror that she was processing the day's events, particularly the emotional conversations with parents at the hospital. "James," she said suddenly, breaking the silence, "do you ever wonder if what we do actually makes a difference?" The question caught him off guard. In 3 years of protecting her, Catherine had never asked for his opinion on anything beyond security matters. "I think about the mother you spoke with today," James replied carefully. "Being able to stay with her son during treatment because of the accommodation wing you helped fund. That's going to make a real difference in their lives." Catherine nodded slowly, but he could see she was still troubled by something. "Sometimes I feel like I'm just cutting ribbons and shaking hands," she continued, "like it's all performance." James felt a surge of protective instinct, not for her physical safety, but for her emotional well-being. He wanted to tell her that he had seen the real impact of her work, that he had witnessed countless moments where her presence brought genuine comfort to people in difficult situations. But Crossing that line between professional duty and personal support felt dangerous. "Your Royal Highness," he said finally, "I've seen you hold a crying child while their parents met with doctors. I watched you listen to elderly patients tell their stories for an hour past your scheduled departure time. That's not performance." In the mirror, he saw Catherine's expression change, surprise and gratitude flickering across her features. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Sometimes I need to be reminded." As they pulled into the palace grounds, James felt the familiar weight of his dual burden. His job was to protect Catherine from external threats, but increasingly, he found himself wanting to protect her from doubt, from emotional pain, from the isolation that came with her position. It was a desire that went far beyond professional duty, and that realization terrified him. That evening, after Catherine had retired to her private apartments and the security team had completed their shift change, James found himself alone in the security office again. He pulled up the day's surveillance footage, telling himself he was conducting a routine review. But his eyes were drawn to the moments when Catherine thought no one was watching. Her genuine smile when speaking with the young patients, the way her shoulders relaxed when she thought she was alone, the brief instant of vulnerability when she had asked him about making a difference. James removed his white gloves and set them on the desk beside his radio and earpiece. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine what it would be like to offer comfort not as a protection officer, but as a man who cared deeply about her happiness. Then he picked up his gloves and put them back on, sealing away thoughts that could never be spoken and feelings that could never be acknowledged. Outside his window, the lights in Catherine's apartments went dark one by one. James settled in for his final hour of duty, knowing that tomorrow would bring another day of maintaining professional distance while his heart pulled him in the opposite direction. In the silence of the security office, surrounded by monitors and communication equipment, he guarded not just her safety, but the secret that grew stronger with each passing day. The truth behind his gloves was becoming harder to hide, and James wasn't sure how much longer he could maintain the careful balance between duty and the feelings that threatened to consume him. But for now, in the quiet darkness of another day's end, he would continue to protect her in the only way he knew how, from a distance that felt both necessary and unbearable. 3 weeks had passed since the hospital opening, and James found himself struggling with an internal battle that grew more intense with each passing day. His nights were filled with restless sleep, haunted by dreams where the boundaries between duty and desire blurred beyond recognition. During the day, he maintained his professional facade, but the effort was becoming exhausting. The morning briefing carried news that would test his resolve further than ever before. Detective Inspector Collins spread a collection of photographs across the conference table, each one showing Catherine at various public events over the past month. "We've identified a pattern of concerning behavior," Sarah announced to the assembled protection team. These photographs were taken by the same individual at 5 separate events. Marcus Webb, 34, unemployed, with a history of obsessive behavior toward public figures. James studied the images, noting how Webb had managed to position himself prominently in Catherine's line of sight at each event. In several photos, Catherine appeared uncomfortable, though she maintained her public composure. "Webb has been sending letters to the palace," Sarah continued. "Initially harmless fan mail, but the content has become increasingly personal and inappropriate. He claims to have a special connection with Her Royal Highness." The irony wasn't lost on James. Here was a man whose inappropriate feelings toward Catherine were being treated as a security threat, while James struggled daily with his own forbidden emotions. The difference, he told himself, was that he would never act on his feelings, never put Catherine in an uncomfortable position, never cross the line from protection to pursuit. Today's engagement at the National Gallery includes a private viewing followed by a public reception, Sarah continued. Webb has not been issued an invitation, but given his pattern of showing up at events, we need to be particularly vigilant. As the team reviewed security protocols for the gallery event, James found his attention drifting to memories from the previous evening. Catherine had been working late in her private study, reviewing speeches for upcoming engagements. He had been stationed in the corridor outside, officially monitoring security feeds, but increasingly aware of her presence behind the closed door. Around midnight, she had emerged from the study looking exhausted and frustrated. Seeing James in the hallway, she had paused, seemingly surprised to find him there. "James, you should have gone off duty hours ago," she had said, concern evident in her voice. "Detective Sergeant Williams called in sick, Your Royal Highness." "I volunteered to cover his shift," James had replied, which was partially true. Williams had indeed called in sick, but James had volunteered specifically to avoid going home to his empty flat where he would spend the night thinking about Catherine. "You work too many hours," Catherine had said quietly. "It's not healthy." The genuine concern in her voice had affected him more deeply than he cared to admit. Standing alone in the dimly lit corridor, she had seemed less like the Princess of Wales and more like a woman who worried about the people around her. "The job requires dedication," James had replied, though even as he said it, he knew his motivation went far beyond professional obligation. Catherine had studied his face in the soft hallway lighting, and, for a moment, James had felt as though she could see straight through his carefully maintained professional mask. "James," she had said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I hope you know that your dedication doesn't go unnoticed. You go above and beyond what anyone could expect." Before he could respond, she had returned to her apartments, leaving him alone with thoughts that kept him awake for the remainder of his shift. Now, sitting in the morning briefing, James forced himself to focus on the security concerns for the day ahead. The National Gallery event would be challenging enough without the additional complication of Marcus Webb's potential presence. The team arrived at the gallery 2 hours before Catherine's scheduled appearance. James worked with the museum security staff to review access points and establish communication protocols. The building's grand architecture and numerous alcoves presented unique challenges for maintaining clear sight lines and monitoring potential threats. As he walked through the gallery's main exhibition hall, James found himself pausing before a particular painting, a Renaissance portrait of a noble woman whose expression seemed to capture both strength and melancholy. Something about the woman's eyes reminded him of Catherine during her more vulnerable moments, when the weight of public expectation became visible beneath her composed exterior. "Powerful piece, isn't it?" came a voice beside him. James turned to find Dr. Helena Morrison, the gallery's chief curator, approaching with a welcoming smile. "The subject appears to be carrying the weight of the world," James observed, immediately regretting the personal nature of his comment. Dr. Morrison nodded thoughtfully. "Lady Margaret Beaufort, mother of Henry VII. She wielded enormous influence during one of England's most tumultuous periods, but at great personal cost. The artist captured both her strength and her sacrifice." James found the parallel unsettling. Catherine, too, wielded influence and made sacrifices, though the nature of her burden was different from that of a medieval noblewoman. Catherine's arrival at the gallery was preceded by the usual flurry of final security checks and protocol confirmations. As her motorcade pulled up to the main entrance, James took his customary position, scanning the gathered crowd of onlookers and media personnel. His trained eye immediately spotted Marcus Webb standing across the street, holding a bouquet of flowers and wearing an expectant expression. "Target identified." James spoke quietly into his radio. "Webb is positioned across the street, southwest corner." Sarah's voice crackled back immediately. "Maintain visual contact. Do not approach unless he attempts to breach security perimeter." Catherine emerged from her car with practiced grace, pausing to wave at the crowd before making her way up the gallery's front steps. James noticed her slight hesitation when her gaze fell on Webb, though she quickly masked any discomfort with a professional smile. The private viewing proceeded smoothly, with Catherine engaging knowledgeably with Dr. Morrison about the exhibition's historical significance. James positioned himself strategically throughout the gallery, maintaining visual contact with Catherine while monitoring radio communications about Webb's movements outside. "Your Royal Highness," Dr. Morrison was saying as they stood before a collection of Tudor-era portraits. "These paintings offer insight into how royal women of the period managed to maintain influence despite the constraints of their time." Catherine studied the portraits with genuine interest, her attention particularly drawn to the same Lady Margaret Beaufort painting that had captivated James earlier. "She looks isolated despite her power," Catherine observed thoughtfully. "There's loneliness in her expression." Dr. Morrison nodded. "Historical accounts suggest she made enormous personal sacrifices for the sake of her son's reign and England's stability. Power often comes at the cost of personal happiness." James watched Catherine's reaction to this observation, noting the way her expression grew more thoughtful, more introspective. He wondered if she saw parallels to her own situation, whether she sometimes felt the isolation that came with her position. The transition to the public reception brought increased security challenges. Over 200 invited guests filled the gallery's main hall, creating a complex environment for monitoring potential threats. James coordinated with his team to maintain security zones while allowing Catherine the freedom to interact naturally with attendees. Midway through the reception, James noticed Catherine's energy beginning to flag. She had been engaging continuously with guests for over an hour, listening to their stories, answering questions about her charitable work, and posing for countless photographs. Only James seemed to notice the subtle signs of fatigue, the way she occasionally touched her temple, the slight decrease in the brightness of her smile. During a brief lull between conversations, James approached Dr. Morrison with a suggestion that technically exceeded his authority but felt necessary for Catherine's well-being. "Dr. Morrison, might there be a quiet space where Her Royal Highness could have a few minutes to review her notes for the closing remarks?" James asked diplomatically. Dr. Morrison immediately understood the unspoken request. "Of course. My office is just down the corridor. Very private and comfortable." James caught Catherine's eye and gestured toward Dr. Morrison, who extended the invitation for a brief respite. Catherine's grateful expression told him she understood his intervention and appreciated the consideration. The curator's office was indeed a peaceful retreat from the reception's energy. Catherine settled into a comfortable chair beside a window overlooking the gallery's sculpture garden. "You didn't have to arrange this," she said to James once they were alone. "But thank you. You've been engaging with guests for over an hour, Your Royal Highness." A brief break seemed appropriate. James replied, maintaining professional distance despite the intimacy of the moment. Catherine was quiet for several minutes, gazing out at the garden where late afternoon sunlight filtered through the trees. James positioned himself by the door, officially maintaining security but privately concerned about her obvious exhaustion. "James," she said suddenly, "can I ask you something personal?" The question caught him completely off guard. In 3 years of protecting her, Catherine had never asked him anything personal. "Of course, Your Royal Highness," he replied, though his pulse quickened with apprehension. "Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Like the person you are in public is so different from who you really are that sometimes you forget which one is real?" The vulnerability in her question was devastating. James felt an overwhelming urge to comfort her, to tell her that he saw both versions of her, the public princess and the private woman, and that both were equally real and worthy of protection. "I think," James said carefully, "that everyone has different aspects of themselves that they show in different circumstances. The challenge is making sure the private self doesn't get lost in the public role." Catherine turned from the window to look at him directly. "You see more than most people," she said. "You're always there, always watching, always protecting. What do you see when you look at me?" The question hung in the air between them, dangerous in its intimacy. James felt as though they were standing at the edge of a cliff, and his next words would determine whether they stepped back to safety or fell into territory from which there would be no return. "I see someone who genuinely cares about making a positive difference in the world," James replied, choosing his words with extreme care. Someone who feels deeply about the causes she supports and the people she meets. Someone who carries responsibility with grace, even when it's difficult. Catherine's eyes filled with unexpected tears. "You see me," she said simply. "Not the title, not the role. Me." The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken understanding and dangerous possibility. James felt his professional resolve wavering, his heart pulling him toward words that could never be taken back. Before either of them could cross that invisible line, James's radio crackled with urgent communication. Code yellow, came Sarah's voice. "Webb has breached the outer perimeter. All units respond." James immediately switched into full alert mode, his personal feelings subsumed by professional necessity. "Your Royal Highness, we need to return to the reception immediately. There's been a security breach." Catherine nodded, instantly transforming back into public mode despite the emotional vulnerability she had just shared. As they made their way back to the main hall, James coordinated with his team via radio while maintaining protective positioning around Catherine. The situation with Webb was contained quickly and professionally. He had managed to enter the gallery's public areas with his bouquet of flowers, approaching several guests and claiming to have a message for Catherine. Security personnel intercepted him before he could get within 50 feet of her, and he was escorted from the building without incident. Catherine completed her closing remarks at the reception with her usual poise, thanking the gallery staff and guests for their support of the arts. To the public eye, nothing unusual had occurred. Only James was aware of the emotional conversation that had taken place during their brief time alone, and the way it had changed something fundamental between them. During the drive back to Kensington Palace, Catherine was unusually quiet. James monitored radio traffic, confirming that Webb had been taken into custody for questioning, but his attention was divided between security concerns and the memory of Catherine's vulnerability in the curator's office. "James," Catherine said as they approached the palace gates. "About our conversation earlier, Your Royal Highness," James interrupted gently. "You were understandably tired after a long engagement. Sometimes fatigue makes us say things we might not normally share." He was offering her an out, a way to pretend the moment of intimacy had never happened. But instead of accepting his diplomatic escape, Catherine met his eyes in the rearview mirror. "I wasn't tired," she said quietly. "I was being honest. Perhaps more honest than I should have been." The weight of her admission settled over them as they passed through the palace security checkpoint. James felt as though they had crossed an invisible boundary, and there would be no going back to the purely professional relationship they had maintained for 3 years. That evening, after Catherine had retired to her private apartments, and the day's shift had ended, James found himself walking the palace grounds alone. The autumn air was crisp, and the gardens were quiet except for the distant sound of London traffic beyond the palace walls. He thought about Catherine's question, whether he felt like he was living someone else's life. The truth was, he had been living a carefully constructed professional persona for so long that he sometimes forgot who James Mitchell really was beneath the uniform and protocol. But in those moments when Catherine let her guard down, when she showed him the person behind the title, he felt most like himself. The irony was devastating. He felt most authentic when he was with someone he could never truly be with. His radio crackled with the night shift's check-in procedures, reminding him that even during his off hours, he remained connected to the complex machinery of royal protection. As he walked back toward the security building, James caught sight of a light in one of Catherine's windows. She was still awake, perhaps dealing with the same restless thoughts that plagued his own evenings. James paused in the courtyard, looking up at that distant window, allowing himself a brief moment of honest acknowledgement. He was in love with Catherine, Princess of Wales, and that love was both the driving force behind his dedication to protecting her and the greatest threat to his ability to do his job effectively. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities for maintaining professional distance, while managing personal feelings that grew stronger each day. But tonight, Standing alone in the palace courtyard, James allowed himself to feel the full weight of his impossible situation. The light in Catherine's window went dark, and James made his way to the security office to complete his final reports of the day. Behind his white gloves, his hands shook slightly as he typed, the physical manifestation of emotions he could never express. The secret he carried was becoming heavier, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could bear its weight without breaking. The Christmas season brought an intensity to palace life that stretched every member of the royal protection team to their limits. December engagements multiplied exponentially, each event carrying the added complexity of holiday crowds and heightened security concerns. For James, the increased workload provided a welcome distraction from the growing tension between his professional duties and personal feelings. The morning briefing on December 15th carried news that would change everything. Detective Inspector Collins stood before the assembled team with an expression more serious than usual, holding a manila folder that James somehow knew would alter the trajectory of his carefully maintained equilibrium. Effective January 1st, there will be significant changes to the Princess of Wales Protection Detail, Sarah announced without preamble. The Metropolitan Police has decided to rotate personnel who have served on high-profile assignments for extended periods. Mitchell, you're being transferred to the Parliamentary Protection Command. The words hit James like a physical blow. After 3 years of protecting Catherine, of becoming intimately familiar with her routines, her vulnerabilities, and her needs, he was being reassigned to guard politicians in Westminster. The transfer was presented as a career advancement, an opportunity to broaden his experience within the protection services. When James managed to ask, his voice carefully controlled despite the chaos in his mind. January 3rd, your replacement, Detective Sergeant Amanda Foster, will begin shadowing the detail next week to ensure a smooth transition. James nodded professionally, accepting the news with the stoic composure expected of a protection officer. But internally, he felt as though the ground beneath his feet had given way. The thought of leaving Catherine's security to someone else, of no longer being the person who ensured her safety, created an almost physical pain in his chest. As the briefing continued with discussions of holiday security protocols, James struggled to focus on operational details. His mind raced with implications he couldn't voice. Who would notice when Catherine was pushing herself too hard? Who would recognize the subtle signs of her emotional distress? Who would understand the difference between her public persona and her private vulnerabilities? The answer, of course, was that someone else would learn these things. Amanda Foster would gradually develop the same protective instincts, the same ability to anticipate Catherine's needs. The continuity of protection would be maintained, just as it had been maintained through countless personnel changes over the years. But for James, the thought of being replaced felt like a fundamental rejection of everything he had dedicated himself to. More troubling still was the realization that his distress went far beyond professional pride. The prospect of not seeing Catherine daily, of not being part of her world, revealed the depth of feelings he had been trying so desperately to deny. That afternoon's engagement was a visit to a children's hospice in North London, an event that would typically require James's full attention and careful coordination with the facility staff. Instead, he found himself distracted by the knowledge that his time in this role was coming to an end. Catherine seemed to sense something different about him as they traveled to the hospice. She had grown accustomed to his focused professionalism, his ability to blend into the background while remaining utterly present. Today, however, there was a tension in his posture that caught her attention. "James," she said during the drive, "you seem distracted today. Is everything all right?" The question forced James to make a split-second decision about how much to reveal. Sharing news of his transfer would be appropriate. She had a right to know about changes to her security detail. But explaining his emotional response to that transfer would cross every professional boundary he had sworn to maintain. "There will be some changes to your protection detail after the new year, Your Royal Highness," James replied carefully. "I've been assigned to a different role within the protection services." He watched in the rearview mirror as Catherine processed this information. Her expression shifted subtly, surprise giving way to something that looked almost like sadness. "I see," she said quietly. "Will you be leaving the protection services entirely?" "No, Your Royal Highness. I'll be working parliamentary protection at Westminster. It's considered a promotion." Catherine was quiet for several minutes, gazing out the window at the London streets passing by. When she spoke again, her voice carried an emotion James couldn't quite identify. "I'll miss having you on the team," she said. "You've been very dedicated to the role." The simple statement carried far more weight than its words suggested. James felt as though Catherine was acknowledging something unspoken between them, recognizing that his protection had been motivated by more than professional duty. The hospice visit proceeded with James maintaining his usual vigilant attention to security, but part of his mind remained focused on Catherine's reactions throughout the day. He found himself studying her interactions with the children, memorizing the way she listened to their stories, the gentle manner in which she comforted worried parents. During a particularly emotional conversation with a young boy who was excited to show Catherine his artwork, James noticed tears forming in her eyes. It was a moment of genuine vulnerability that he had witnessed countless times over 3 years, but now he realized how few people ever saw this side of her compassion. As they prepared to leave the hospice, Catherine lingered longer than scheduled, reluctant to end her conversations with the children and their families. James understood her reluctance. These interactions represented the most meaningful aspect of her role, the moments when protocol gave way to genuine human connection. "Your Royal Highness," James said gently, approaching her with the practiced diplomacy he had developed from managing her tendency to extend visits beyond their allocated time. "We have a 15-minute drive to the next engagement." Catherine nodded, but turned back for one final conversation with a teenage girl who had been waiting patiently for her attention. As James watched this interaction, he realized that his replacement would need to understand not just Catherine's security requirements, but her emotional needs as well. The evening engagement was a Christmas concert at Westminster Abbey, a formal event with significant security challenges due to the high-profile guest list and media presence. As James coordinated with Abbey security and positioned his team throughout the historic building, he found himself thinking about how many similar events he had managed over the past 3 years. During the concert, Catherine sat in the front row with other members of the royal family, her attention focused on the choir's performance. James maintained his position at the side of the nave, his eyes constantly scanning the congregation while remaining peripherally aware of Catherine's presence. The music was hauntingly beautiful, filling the ancient space with harmonies that seemed to transcend the formal nature of the event. During a particularly moving rendition of Silent Night, James noticed Catherine discreetly wiping away tears. The combination of the music and the knowledge that their professional relationship was ending created an emotional weight that James struggled to bear. After the concert concluded and Catherine had completed her official duties, they found themselves alone in one of the Abbey's side chapels while waiting for her car to navigate through the media crowds outside. The space was quiet and dimly lit, offering a stark contrast to the public ceremony they had just experienced. "James," Catherine said suddenly, breaking the contemplative silence, "I want you to know that your service has meant more to me than you might realize." The formal nature of her words couldn't disguise the genuine emotion behind them. James felt the careful barriers he had constructed beginning to crumble under the weight of her acknowledgement. "It has been an honor to serve on your protection detail, Your Royal Highness," he replied, using protocol to maintain distance even as his heart urged him toward honesty. Catherine moved closer, and in the chapel's dim lighting, she looked less like the Princess of Wales and more like the woman he had fallen in love with despite every professional instinct telling him it was impossible. "You've seen me at my worst moments," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "When I've been tired, frustrated, overwhelmed. And you've never judged, never made me feel like my emotions were inappropriate." James felt as though they were standing at the edge of the same precipice they had approached to the National Gallery, but this time the ground beneath them felt less stable. "Your Royal Highness," he began, intending to deflect with another professional response, but Catherine interrupted him. "Please," she said, "not tonight. Tonight, could you just be James? Not the protection officer, not the man following protocol. Just James." The request was devastating in its simplicity. For 3 years, James had been disciplined in maintaining his professional identity, never allowing his personal feelings to surface in Catherine's presence. Now she was asking him to abandon that carefully constructed barrier. "Catherine," he said her name quietly, and the sound of it without her title felt like crossing into forbidden territory. "You have to know that protecting you has been more than just a job." The admission hung between them in the sacred space, dangerous and irreversible. Catherine's eyes searched his face, and James realized that she had been carrying her own burden of unspoken feelings. "I know," she whispered. "I've known for months." The revelation that she had been aware of his feelings created a mixture of relief and terror. If she had known, why hadn't she requested his reassignment? Why had she allowed the tension to build between them? "James," she continued, moving even closer, "when I'm with you, I feel like I can be myself. Not the princess, not the public figure. Just Catherine." James felt his resolve completely dissolving. For a moment that felt suspended outside of time and consequence, he allowed himself to imagine what it would be like to close the distance between them, to offer comfort not as a protection officer, but as a man who loved her. "We can't," he said, as much to himself as to her. "You know we can't." Catherine's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded in understanding. "I know, but I needed you to know that if circumstances were different." She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. The unspoken words hung between them, acknowledging a love that could exist only in imagination. James's radio crackled with communication from the advance team, breaking the spell that had enveloped them in the chapel. "Primary vehicle is ready for departure," came Sarah's voice. The return of protocol felt jarring after the emotional intimacy they had just shared. James straightened his posture and resumed his professional demeanor, though something fundamental had changed between them. During the drive back to Kensington Palace, they sat in silence that felt different from their usual comfortable quiet. This silence was heavy with acknowledged feelings and impossible possibilities. As they approached the palace gates, Catherine spoke one final time. "James, I want you to know that whoever replaces you will never understand this role the way you have. You've been more than a protection officer. You've been—" She paused, searching for words that wouldn't cross too many lines. "You've been a true guardian," she finished. "In every sense of the word." James felt the weight of her gratitude and the simultaneous agony of their impossible situation. "Thank you, Your Royal Highness. That means everything to me." The remainder of December passed with James and Catherine maintaining careful professional distance, both conscious that their time together was ending and that their moment of emotional honesty had changed the nature of their relationship. James threw himself into ensuring a seamless transition for his replacement, briefing Amanda Foster on every detail of Catherine's security requirements and personal tendencies. On his final day of duty, January 2nd, James completed his last security sweep of Catherine's schedule. The day's engagement was a private meeting with charity representatives, a quiet event that would allow him to conclude his service without the complexity of a major public appearance. As Catherine prepared to leave for the meeting, she paused in the corridor where James was conducting his final radio check. "James," she said quietly, "I have something for you." She handed him a small wrapped package, simple brown paper tied with a ribbon. "A token of appreciation for your service," she said formally, but her eyes conveyed far more personal gratitude. Inside the package, James found a silver cufflink set engraved with the Prince of Wales feathers and a small card in Catherine's handwriting. "For JM, with deepest gratitude for 3 years of exceptional service and dedication. You will be remembered always. C." The gift was perfectly appropriate, something she could give to any departing staff member. But James understood the deeper message embedded in her choice of words and the personal nature of the handwritten note. "Thank you, Your Royal Highness," James replied, his voice thick with emotion he couldn't entirely suppress. "It has been the greatest honor of my career." Catherine smiled, and, for just a moment, her professional composure slipped enough to reveal the woman behind the title. "Take care of yourself, James. You deserve to be happy." With those words, she turned and walked away, leaving James alone in the corridor where they had shared so many brief conversations over the years. As he watched her disappear around the corner, James realized that part of his heart would remain forever in the palace corridors, protecting a woman he could never have but would never stop loving. 3 months later, James received word through official channels that Catherine's new protection team had successfully prevented a serious security threat during a public engagement in Manchester. Reading the report, he felt a combination of relief that she was safe and a sharp pang of regret that he hadn't been there to protect her himself. From his new position at Westminster, James occasionally saw Catherine at state functions and official ceremonies. They maintained perfect professional courtesy during these encounters, acknowledging each other with polite nods and formal greetings. To outside observers, they were simply a former protection officer and the royal he had once guarded. But James carried with him the memory of a woman who had trusted him with her vulnerabilities, who had seen beyond his professional facade to the man underneath. And somewhere in Catherine's private moments, he hoped she remembered a guardian who had loved her silently and completely, protecting not just her physical safety, but the secret of her humanity in a world that demanded perfection. The white gloves James had worn for 3 years were packed away in his dresser drawer, along with the silver cufflinks Catherine had given him. Behind those gloves had been hands that had trembled with unspoken emotion, that had wanted to offer comfort beyond the boundaries of duty. The story they could tell would remain forever untold, a secret love story hidden within the formal structures of royal protection. In the end, James had kept his most important promise, not just to protect Catherine from external threats, but to protect her from the complication of his own feelings. It was perhaps the greatest act of love he could offer, the sacrifice of his own happiness to preserve hers. Behind the gloves, his heart would continue to beat for a woman he could never have, in a love story that existed only in the space between duty and desire, where the most profound emotions often remain forever unspoken.